To begin our second session tonight, we have Professor Paul Umina from Cesar, where he oversees the Sustainable Agriculture Division. Paul is a leader in pest management in Australia and oversees regularly presenting at conferences, workshops and industry meetings. And I've been the beneficiary of his presentations and workshops. He is also the creator of Pest Facts in Southeastern Australia, the highly successful newsletter for people working in broadacre crops and pastures. And if you haven't had a chance to use Pest Facts, I strongly encourage you to explore the Cesar website. Invaluable resource for everybody. Tonight, Paul is going to discuss insecticide resistance and management options for red-legged earth mite in Australia, a recurrent threat to our clover component and many of our pastures. Thank you, Paul. I'll let you begin.
Thank you, Damien, for the introduction. I'll just share my screen and we'll get going. Good evening, everyone. As Damien said, I guess tonight I'm really here to talk about red-legged earth mites, but in particular, I guess, talk a little bit about insecticide resistance in this pest, given that it is a bit of an evolving story and one that perhaps some of you have heard a little bit about, but perhaps don't know the entire backdrop, and I guess that's the purpose of tonight. Before I proceed, I do just want to acknowledge the co-author of this work, Aston Arthur, who leads now a lot of our red-legged earth mite research here at Cesar. So I suspect there are most people here tonight that would be familiar with red-legged earth mites and that would, I guess, be managing mites on a paddock by paddock basis, but perhaps not everyone is familiar with this particular mite. So I just want to give a very brief background about, I guess, the pest that we're talking about tonight. So this mite is very ubiquitous. It would be found in almost every pasture paddock in southern Australia, I dare say. It's found particularly in climates with a Mediterranean type climate. It's very polyphagous, which means it attacks a very wide variety of plants. So it's not just a pest of pastures, where it certainly can be very damaging to clovers and medics and grasses, as well as lucerne, but it's also a very important pest in the grains industry. So, for example, it attacks canolas, cereals, and pulses as well. So it's a pretty impressive beast in terms of its ability to attack a pretty wide variety of plants. Look, most people are probably aware that most of our damage we see with red-legged earth mites is at that seedling establishment phase in autumn. But of course, this is a pest that's around through the whole winter cropping season. So they certainly are causing damage right through to spring. This particular species that we're talking about tonight absolutely causes significant economic losses to pastures each year in Australia. A very recent economic assessment and survey done by the University of Melbourne, which only concluded this year, estimated the costs to be greater than $200 million in dry matter production losses per year just to dairy pastures in southeastern Australia. So if you sort of scale that up to consider, pastures across the country, particularly given the distribution of this particular species, you can see that this particular pest is very, very damaging. And I think in many cases, it is going unnoticed in terms of the quantum of damage that we're actually suffering at the hands of this tiny little mite. We heard earlier about the importance of identification when it came to clovers, and certainly that's a key point here with red-legged earth mites as well. Getting your identification right is critically important when thinking about management options and what is, the most appropriate tactic to take in managing this particular pest. And the reason I wanted to just introduce this particular topic tonight is because we know that in many cases, red-legged earth mites are going misdiagnosed and they are easily misidentified as some other mites that we do find in pastures in southern Australia. And the reasons for that are very simple, and it is a very difficult thing to do. These mites are very, very small. They're only about the size of a pinhead, so they're only about 1 millimetre long. So it's very difficult to even spot these things, let alone be confident that you've got the right ID. So I will talk a little bit later about some resources that are available to assist But just briefly, in terms of just giving you a couple of quick pointers before we move on around identification, given that it is so important. This mite, as its name suggests, has 8 orange to red coloured legs. So quite distinctive, and the body is completely black, as you can see here in this photo. But as I said, there are many other mites and even other, I guess, invertebrate pests that are easily misidentified for red-legged earth mites. This mite here, something called the blue oat mite, is almost identical in its size and shape. It also has 8 orange to red coloured legs, and it also has a dark coloured body. This is a mite that we find often in pastures in southern Australia. So it's going to be found in the same sort of environments, and it's also found at the same time as red-legged earth mites. So this is a challenge when it comes to trying to differentiate, for example, these 2 species. What you can see on that slide with the blue oat mite, it does have that very distinctive red patch on the back. So that is a really good characteristic to be able to differentiate these 2 species. But of course, there are many other mites. None of these things are often that simple. So we've got bryobia mites, or also called the clover mite, and Ballorstia mites. So these are all mites that we find in pastures in southern Australia, and they all look pretty similar to the naked eye. They're all pretty small, they're all sort of dark-bodied, and they're all sort of found around the same time. So that there are challenges. One of the other advantages, I guess, from a diagnostics perspective that I'll just leave you with before I move on, is that as you can see in that photo in the middle here, you've got these feeding aggregations of mites, and this is the red-legged earth mite. So this is the species we're talking about tonight. So one of the things that's quite characteristic with red-legged earth mites is that when you see these feeding on clovers or grasses or indeed broadleaf weeds in a pasture paddock, you often find them feeding in these large feeding aggregations. So they don't typically feed on their own. Whereas these other mites that I've introduced very briefly here tonight do tend to feed more on their own or in very, very small groups. So, you know, that is a bit of an indication based on the numbers that you see, whether you might be dealing with red-legged earth mites or something else. But again, I'll talk about some resources that are available later on. With any, I guess, pest management, I think it's really important that we have a basic or perhaps even an in-depth understanding of the life cycle of the pest that we're trying to manage. I think that really helps us, and I think really sets a foundation of pest management. And so with red-legged earth mites, and again, I'm sure there are many tonight that already perhaps know some of this, red-legged earth mites are typically present from around April to October, November, depending on location. So during that period, they undergo 3, perhaps 4 generations a year, but they're not active over the summer months. So what happens with this red-legged earth mite here in Australia is that in that last generation of the year, so that spring generation, they stop producing winter eggs and they start to produce what's called diapause eggs, these summer eggs that lay dormant over the summer months. So red-legged earth mites are just not active at all over summer. So they've adapted really well to our conditions. So they produce these eggs that allow the mite to persist during our very hot and very dry summer months. And those eggs don't hatch out until the following autumn, and only after we get a reduction in temperatures and we start to get some rainfall. So they're really highly adapted to our conditions. And this life cycle is really important because it can give us a bit of an insight, and it can be something that we target in terms of management strategies. So I guess tonight we're really here to talk about insecticide resistance in this species. And as I said at the outset, this is a bit of an evolving story. And tonight, I guess what I want to do is just provide a really brief background about where we've come from and I guess where we currently are right now. So insecticide resistance in red-legged earth mites is a fairly recent discovery. It was first found back in 2006, and it was found in Western Australia near Esperance. And this was in response to some chemical control failures that were being experienced on this farm by this particular grower. And we, I guess we collected mites from this area, we tested these mites, and we found that these mites had evolved insecticide resistance, and that was why this particular grower was having these chemical control failures. What we found was that these mites were resistant to one particular chemical group called pyrethroid. So this is an insecticide group a very widely used insecticide group. You may know some of the trade names as things like Telstar or Fastac or Trojan. These are all synthetic pyrethroids, and these mites at this property were found to be resistant to these particular chemicals. I won't sort of go into the details of these particular figures and in terms of how we identify resistance. I think that the really important thing though that I wanted to mention was the levels of resistance that we saw in that field were incredibly high. And that's really important because you can have very low levels of resistance, you can have medium levels of resistance, but you can have very high levels of resistance. And these mites were very, very resistant. So we found that these mites, when exposed to, for example, a product like Telstar bifenthrin, were 240,000 times more resistant than our average red-legged earth mite population that doesn't have resistance. And so what that meant for that grower and what that means as we move forwards is that it doesn't matter if this guy, this farmer was, and he did in fact do this, apply multiple applications of pyrethroids, or in fact ultimately try to increase the dose that he was spraying, so above the label registered rates, he was still unable to get any control whatsoever of these mites. So this was our first discovery of resistance, as I said, going back about 15 years or so now. Since that time, we have worked very closely with CSIRO and the Department of Agriculture in WA to map the distribution of resistance in that state. And this is basically what we currently know to be the distribution of insecticide resistance in WA in red-legged earth mites. So the crosses here indicate populations that we've collected and we've tested. The circles here indicate where those populations that we've collected and tested have actually been found to have insecticide resistance. So you can clearly see that that resistance is no longer kind of contained just to that region of Esperance. In fact, we now have resistance right across the southern region of the grain belt in WA. So more than 175 properties in WA now have resistance resistance to synthetic pyrethroids. And so this is clearly a bit of a growing issue in WA. And really importantly, some of our recent research has shown that this is not just spread. So all of these mites haven't just evolved once at that original Esperance site, if you like, and spread. Certainly spread is contributing to this pattern here that you're seeing. But what we've found is we're seeing multiple evolution events of resistance occurring in Western Australia. So what that means is resistances have actually occurred independently at different farms in WA over the last 15 years. And that's really important because it means what we do on our individual farms does actually matter when it comes to selecting for resistance in this particular pest in particular. So unfortunately for WA growers and farmers, the story didn't end just there. In 2014, so a few years later, we were also then alerted to some issues where a farmer was having challenges with organophosphate chemicals. So these are products that you might know as Lemat, chlorpyrifos, Lawsban, dimethoate. These sorts of products are all organophosphates. So we use these quite widely in pastures. And again, we looked at these mites, we tested them, and we identified insecticide resistance had also now evolved to a whole different group of chemistries, the organophosphates. And since 2014, we've certainly discovered resistance at now multiple properties in WA. So that is also something that is spreading and potentially also evolving independently now in WA. So I think at last count from our resistance surveillance work, we have over 50 properties and populations of red-legged earth mites with resistance to organophosphates in WA. So that's kind of the backdrop of resistance to organophosphates and pyrethroids in WA. But what does it mean for us over here on the East Coast? And as I guess the slide alludes to, we're no longer immune to insecticide-resistant red-legged earth mites. So I guess quite recently, 3 or 4 years ago, we responded to some control failures in South Australia, where a grower was grappling with red-legged earth mites that he just could not control with insecticides that he had been using and relying upon for many years, and that up until this point were actually providing very good control. So again, we investigated what was going on to see if this was, an application issue or whether this was resistance. And in fact, what we found was that mites on this property had evolved resistance to both organophosphates and synthetic pyrethroids. So these mites were difficult to control with both of these chemical groups. And this is really, I guess, the fundamental reason as to why this grower was really, I guess, tearing his hair out. Again, I'm not going to sort of go into too many of the details around the interpretation of these sorts of figures. But I guess, again, in terms of looking at the levels of resistance, what we saw for the pyrethroids was exactly the same as what we'd seen in WA. Very, very, very high levels of resistance. You're not going to be able to get control of these mites. It doesn't matter what synthetic pyrethroids you spray, and it doesn't matter what rate you spray. They just won't be controlled. They just can't be killed with pyrethroids anymore. The organophosphate resistance that we saw in South Australia was a little bit different. So we actually saw a much lower level of resistance, which for this particular grower was obviously quite advantageous. He could still get some control of those red-legged earth mites when he sprayed organophosphates, even though they were resistant, but the level of efficacy, the level of control that he was able to achieve was certainly diminished. It was nothing like what he was able to get previously. And unfortunately, we know that if he continues to rely upon those organophosphates, it's very, very likely that that resistance will actually increase in its intensity. The level of resistance will increase to a point where even the organophosphates will be completely ineffective. So this is a real challenge for growers who have resistance on their properties. And I guess very, very recently, late last year, we had the first discovery of insecticide resistance in Victoria in red-legged earth mites. And in this instance, those mites had evolved resistance to organophosphates only, so products like Lemat, chlorpyrifos, dimethoate, etc. There was no resistance to our pyrethroid chemicals. So, if we look at, I guess, some maps to try to get a sense of where resistances are in red-legged earth mites in the east, this is a map for pyrethroid chemicals. You can see that it's contained to South Australia, but it's certainly in 3 quite distinct regions, including, a little bit surprisingly, on Kangaroo Island. And if we look then at where we're seeing organophosphate resistance, pretty similar pattern, but obviously you can see that one population that has very recently been identified in Victoria, which is in central Victoria. So, we're certainly nowhere near looking at the same sort of maps and the same sort of challenges that I guess our counterparts in the West are experiencing. But really, when I look at these maps, what I see is exactly what we saw early days in Western Australia. So, insecticide resistance, the evolution of insecticide resistance is a very, very dynamic process. It's going to continue to change. There is no doubt that the resistances that we have over here, which really are still very localized, will continue to grow. So these issues are not going away. They'll only get worse. And I guess this is why we need to think about jumping on these sorts of challenges that we're facing now, than, in 5 to 10 years' time, when I think, to some extent, the horse will have already bolted. So what can we do? So how do we manage red-legged earth mites in a way where we're getting, obviously, control, we're protecting clovers and grass-based pastures, but at the same time, we're minimising the selection pressure for further insecticide resistance? And that's what we really have to do. We need to think about doing some things a little bit differently. I don't think we're talking about major differences in terms of how we manage mites, but there's some little things that we can do that will still achieve control and still get us the outcomes we want, but it will reduce the likelihood of these mites evolving resistance on our properties. And I think that's where we need to be looking at. Fortunately, a few years ago, GRDC invested in this resistance management strategy. So this was the first ever, I guess, resistance management strategy developed for red-legged earth mites, and it covers both grains and pastures. And I just wanted to make you aware of this document. It's freely available on the GRDC website. If you haven't seen it, I strongly advise you to, jump on the website, locate that document and download it. It's freely available, and it has some really good recommendations about how we can manage red-legged earth mites. But as I said, reduce that selection pressure. When we talk about insecticide resistance, it's all about reducing selection pressure. And really what that means is that we need to reduce the frequency of insecticide use, but also we need to rotate insecticides if we are relying on chemicals in a sensible and strategic way. And this document that I'm pointing you in the direction of provides some really practical ways in which you can do that. And of course, some of the key recommendations are probably not going to be surprising. We need to avoid the unnecessary application of insecticides in pastures. So if we're going over the paddock with another chemical, we don't want to be throwing in a cheap insecticide just because we're going over the paddock. We certainly need to move away from those, tank mixes. And as I mentioned before, for any resistance management strategy, it doesn't matter if it's red-legged earth mites or any pest, whether it be an insect or a weed or a disease, a really key fundamental tenet is to rotate insecticides between different groups. So that's absolutely what we need to do. So for example, with red-legged earth mites in pastures, if we put out, for example, an organophosphate in autumn to control mites, and we have to come back, in winter or spring because the mite numbers have bounced back, we don't want to use an organophosphate again. We want to switch to a different chemical group. So we really need to think about these rotations. So it's not necessarily just about reducing chemicals, but it's also about which chemicals we use and when. And so again, this document here outlines some of the really practical ways in which we can do that. And then of course, when we think about chemicals, we can also be quite strategic in how we use them. I'm going to talk tonight just a little bit about one strategy called TimeRight. And undoubtedly, wherever possible, we want to be thinking about non-chemical control options. And in the case of red-legged earth mites and pastures, we do have some cultural and biological control options that I'll also just briefly introduce. So firstly, TimeRight. Many people probably have heard of TimeRight, but I'm sure there are many also that have not. So TimeRight has actually been around for many years. It was developed quite some time ago by CSIRO, and it is widely used in managing red-legged earth mites, particularly in pastures. So what TimeRight does, it, targets that vulnerability in the life stage of red-legged earth mites that I talked about before. And it's really in spring when the mites are starting to produce these diapause eggs. And this TimeRight approach targets that stage with a very carefully timed insecticide spray, and it knocks out the red-legged earth mites before they've had a chance to produce those diapause eggs. And so it's a great way to get a really clean break in the life cycle of this particular pest. But really, importantly, it provides a really good flow-on benefit the following year. Because the mites don't produce those diapause eggs, we get a drastic reduction in the number of mites that then hatch out the following autumn. And as I mentioned at the outset, autumn is often a time when we're most concerned about the damage that red-legged earth mites can cause, particularly to annual pastures. So, you want to go onto the TimeRight website. The address is here. Again, this is a freely available tool. And for those that aren't familiar with, what to do, you basically go to this website, you throw in your GPS coordinates of your farm and or your nearest town, and you will actually get a date that is specific to your location. And that's the date, that's the TimeRight date that you can then use to target red-legged earth mites. As I said, it's a very widely used tool, and I'm sure many people are already familiar with and or using this strategy. I would though just point out that it is not a silver bullet. There are absolutely some limitations. And I talked up front about some of the challenges with identification and the importance of identification. So for example, TimeRight was developed specifically for red-legged earth mites. It will not be effective if you actually have blue oat mites or one of those other mites that I mentioned before. So make sure you get your ID right, because that will certainly influence whether TimeRight is or is not appropriate. And also, it's not advisable to be using TimeRight repeatedly in the same paddock year on year. We know that this species is very adaptable, and if we do that if we take that approach of using it repeatedly, we potentially could see red-legged earth mites evolving to overcome TimeRight. And that's, again, not what we want to see. So that's, I guess, one option around starting to use chemicals a little bit differently, although, again, I think there will be many that are already using TimeRight. We can also do some things without chemicals to really drive down red-legged earth mite numbers so that we're relying less on insecticides to get management. One of the really great options available to us in pastures is to selectively graze, particularly in spring. And there's been some great work done many years ago by the Department of Ag in WA that really showed that if we can selectively graze pastures in spring, and we can get that food on offer below about 1.4 tonnes per hectare, we can get a really drastic reduction in the population size of red-legged earth mites. So what happens is a shorter pasture with exposed soil essentially limits the growth in mite populations. So it's a very effective tool if you have that available to you. I mentioned also up front that this species is very polyphagous. It attacks a wide variety of plant types. It doesn't just attack pastures and grain crops, but it also loves weeds, particularly broadleaf weeds, and especially capeweed. And so if we can control capeweed within our pastures, if we can control capeweed along our fence lines, that is also a really effective way in minimising red-legged earth mites in a pasture field. Red-legged earth mites love to breed up and build up in capeweed in particular. So eliminating capeweed from your paddocks will provide a benefit, obviously, in the instance of red-legged earth mites. For those producers, I guess, that are not just pasture-based, but those that have mixed enterprises, crop rotations can also be very effective, particularly if you've got the opportunity to rotate to a pulse crop. Red-legged earth mites don't do particularly well when pulse crops are grown. And so that, again, can naturally suppress red-legged earth mite populations without us having to use chemicals. And then finally, we have biological control options. So what we have available to us in Australia is we have some mites that are called predatory mites. And here's a photo of one such example. And these predatory mites that we have that are native to Australia, but there's also been quite a lot of effort to introduce some native predatory mites from overseas, specifically to control red-legged earth mites. And so these are well-established predatory mites already in southern Australia. But perhaps many of you aren't aware of them or aren't noticing them in your pastures. So they're typically brightly coloured, so they don't typically tend to look like red-legged earth mites. They're typically sort of bright orange or bright red. They move really fast, and these predatory mites, if allowed to build up, can actually provide some good biological control of red-legged earth mites. So there are some options available to us to move away from chemicals. The reality is, though, that this particular species can build up to very high numbers very rapidly. And so there are often going to be cases where chemicals will be needed. But taking a more holistic approach, I think, is where we need to get to. So in terms of some key messages, resistance is certainly here. It's spreading. And as I mentioned before, it's also evolving independently. So this is not going away. I think we have an opportunity to implement strategies now to minimise the risk of further resistance issues. So we certainly want to be avoiding unnecessary applications of insecticides in pastures. When using chemicals, and we will be using them, we want to be rotating between different groups. I'd suggest we should be considering diversifying our control strategies. So think about TimeRight if you're not already using it. Think about some of those cultural and biological control options that I mentioned. But also, we're really just scratching the surface tonight. There is a lot to digest, and there's a lot, obviously, to this story. So there are resources that are available to help. So I just, in the last couple of moments, wanted to mention a couple. Damien alluded to Pest Southeastern. This is a free service that we have around sort of 1,500 or so subscribers in Victoria and southern New South Wales already. So it's a very popular service. And through this service, which is available to growers, to advisors, we do offer free identifications. And we also, I guess, produce these regular online articles throughout the season that report on pest issues, not just red-legged earth mites, but pest issues as they're occurring in real time in grain crops and pastures. So I know many of you are already probably subscribed to this service. If you're not, here are the details. I'd encourage you to jump on board. As I said, it's a free service at the moment, funded by GRDC. I've already talked about this resistance management strategy, which you can find on the GRDC website. Highly recommend you take a look at that. And I've talked a couple of times tonight about identification. And again, there is a resource that is available for free on the GRDC website. So there's this back pocket guide that's all, designed and geared towards helping growers and advisors be confident with their identification of crop mites. So there's some great photos in this guide. So this resource is absolutely available. And finally, and again, this is from the GRDC website, another free document that was only, developed this year. So this is called a Best Management Practice Guide for red-legged earth mites. It's designed specifically for the southern region. Again, you can jump on the website, you can Google this particular term, you'll find this document, you can download it. And again, it's got some great recommendations and strategies about how to manage red-legged earth mites. And as I said, I don't think what we're suggesting is a great shift in how we manage this particular pest, but I think there's some things that we can do a little bit differently that will help us as we move forwards with insecticide resistance. If you are concerned about resistance, if you've had some chemical control failures, get in contact with Aston at Cesar. Here are the details. She can arrange for a resistance testing service of your mites. And again, this is a freely available service to growers and advisors. And at the moment, this is funded through some work that we're doing with GRDC. There are many people that I just would like to acknowledge in terms of funders and a whole variety of different collaborators. And I will leave it there, Damien, and happy to answer questions.
No worries. Thank you very much, Paul, for a wonderful presentation. We've got time for a few questions. There's plenty of them that have come up. We'll tackle a few if we could, very briefly. But Paul, if you've got time, maybe you could potentially answer some of these online while we're listening to Charlie's talk shortly. You've touched on beneficial insects for controlling red-legged earth mite. That was a question from Anthony Close. Quick question from Graham about combination of chemicals. I know Telstar and Lawsban's quite popular amongst some people. Is that only going to sort of promote the development of resistance by using two chemicals at once?
That's a really, really great question. And in fact, the answer is not straightforward, Damien. It really does depend. To some extent, a mixture of two different chemical groups like that can actually be a good resistance management strategy. So that actually can delay and minimise that selection pressure for resistance. The challenge that we really face with red-legged earth mites, particularly in pastures, is we only have two options really available to us. We've got organophosphates and we've got synthetic pyrethroids. So, it's a little bit different to aphids or caterpillars where we might have 3 or 4 or 5 different chemical groups that we can use at any particular time during the season. So one of the challenges that I think we face with red-legged earth mites, if we're thinking about a mixture, is if you use that mixture early on, and we then need to go back with the second application, you're inadvertently putting out that same mode of action at that next generation. And so it's a really complicated one with red-legged earth mites. Certainly, for some species and in some instances, mixing can be a very good strategy, and absolutely it's used quite widely in the grains industry for a whole range of different species, including weeds. In the case of red-legged earth mites, I'm really sitting on the fence. I think it's difficult to give a straight answer unless you can kind of think about what's the risk that I'm likely to still have to put another application out this season. And if the risk is there, then I'd probably suggest it's better to go with solo products and then to rotate.
Yeah, very much so. Another quick one here is population density per square metre before you should consider actually taking action on using an insecticide. So I suppose what's a safe number to have per square metre, and what point or what number do you want to actually start taking some action?
Yeah, in terms of that question. Perhaps I'll type that answer because that's a bit more of I guess,
Okay.
a nuanced answer, and only because it will depend on, I guess, the pasture and the crop type that we're talking about. So I'll actually put some figures into the answer there so everyone can actually see them and take a note of it.
Okay, and there was just a quick question here from Rob, more about the issue with rotating chemicals and the ESI that's required to be observed for synthetic pyrethroids. But one question I'd like to potentially try and address, if you could now, is Tim's asked whether the TimeRight date is affected or moves with drought. So does the date change?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Yeah. And look, TimeRight is not a perfect model. TimeRight accounts for a fair proportion of the variability that I guess predicts when red-legged earth might start to produce those diapause eggs. But Tim and others will know that is, and I mentioned, it's a static date. So once you've got your date, and my property's in central Victoria, we have the same date year in, year out. But in reality, red-legged earth mites are much smarter than that. They're not producing diapause eggs just on that date. It's not just photo period, and that's of course what TimeRight relies upon. Mm-hmm. Red-legged earth mites are influenced by humidity. They're influenced by the health of the pasture. And they're also influenced by temperature. So all of these environmental conditions are at play. So every year, the actual date when red-legged earth mites do start to produce diapause eggs does fluctuate a little bit. Now, the model is our best guess. And so the model works really well in some years, but in years where we have a really severe drought or other environmental conditions will mean that TimeRight date does actually shift around. But at the moment, the model doesn't account for that. And we're actually about to move into an investment with GRDC where we're going to be working with the developers of TimeRight to actually incorporate more real-time climatic data. So, our intention over the next 2 or 3 years, it will have a much more dynamic TimeRight model whereby people will be able to get a much more accurate estimate of when those mites are actually producing diapause eggs. At the moment, that photo period model is really our best available tool.
Yeah. Looking forward to the new and improved TimeRight. There's a couple of other questions there that, Paul, I might try to get you addressed. One by David with regards to an extension of this theme where the red-legged earth mites don't seem to be such an issue in wet years. And then a question from Anonymous just regarding nutritional levels of the plant and whether that makes them more or less susceptible to red-legged earth mite. But if you could address those online,
okay,
that would be fantastic. Just in the order of time, we really need to get on to Charlie's talk. But Paul, thank you once again for a great talk. It's good to be reminded about red-legged earth mite, something we tend to overlook at times. Thank you very much.